Hello, my name's Ian and I'm a Christadelphian, and I'm going to share with you this evening one of a series of presentations about the evidence for gospel accuracy. So why do we need to do that? Well, it's a fact that some people are skeptical about the historical accuracy of the Gospels. They hold to the idea that the Gospels are fiction, made up a long time after the first century, and that hence the Gospels are unreliable accounts of the actions and teachings of Jesus. Well, you might think, well, it's impossible to know whether the Gospels describe real events or whether they're just made up pieces of fiction. How can we tell whether it's history or fiction? And we're going to be thinking about this idea of undesigned coincidences in this presentation. An undesigned coincidence is where one episode in the Gospels mentions something that's perhaps unexplained or it seems extraneous, and then you turn to a completely different episode, a different account, maybe in a different Gospel, and you find some other source of information that the writer of the first account didn't mention, and then the other account or fact explains the first account, the first episode. And the idea is it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for a writer of fiction to include features like this in their writing. And so it therefore gives us confidence that it's not fiction, but that it's describing real events. So they're undesigned because the author or the authors of the details haven't deliberately slipped this information in. They're just incidental facts to the main narrative, and they are coincidences because they're in harmony with each other and they're not in conflict. And in this presentation we'll look at 5 of these undesigned coincidences in the Gospels. So let's start by looking at this verse in Matthew's Gospel. When Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick with a fever. He touched her hand and the fever left her, and she rose and began to serve him. So we're reading about a miracle that Jesus did, and it's a miracle of healing, of which of course there are many in the Gospels. And in this particular miracle we're being told who it is that's being healed. Now that's not unique. Sometimes when Jesus heals someone, we're just told that it's a lame man or a blind man or similar. But other times we're given the identity of the person that is being healed by the Gospel writer. And this time it's Peter's mother-in-law who is being healed. So Peter is one of Jesus' 12 disciples, and there are quite a lot of stories that Peter features in. He's a fisherman from Galilee. But what we're being told here is to do with his mother-in-law. So we do learn something about Peter, although he's not really in the story. We learn that Peter has a mother-in-law. Well, obviously if he's got a mother-in-law, that means he must be married. But Matthew isn't mentioning Peter's wife here. She's not part of the story at all. And really the fact that Peter is being mentioned isn't very important to what's going on here. The main thing is that Jesus is healing a lady, and that he's able to touch her and a fever leaves her. That's the main point of the narrative. And just as an incidental fact, we can work out that Peter must have a wife. Now, the other reference that we're looking at this time for this coincidence is one from Paul's letters. Paul here is writing to the believers in Corinth, and let's see what he writes. He says, "Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas?" So the point that Paul is making here is to do with whether it's okay for apostles, teachers to be married. And he mentions Jesus brothers, and then he mentions somebody called Cephas. Now you may realise that Cephas is another name for Peter, Peter the fisherman, and they're in fact the same name in two different languages. Peter is the Greek form; it means, the name means rock, and Cephas is the Aramaic for the same name. It also means rock. But these two people, Peter and Cephas, are exactly the same person. They're both Simon Peter, one of the 12 disciples, the fisherman from Galilee. And you see, what we're being told about Cephas in this other verse is also in passing. The main point of this is that it's okay to have a wife. You don't have to be single. Paul is saying that's a right that he has. But in passing, he mentions, well, Peter is somebody who has a wife. He is married. So the point here in this undesigned coincidence is that both Bible passages are just assuming a fact about the real world without making a big thing about it. And so it's reasonable to assume that the writers, Matthew and Paul, have knowledge of that real world. They're not just writing fiction, they're not making guesses. These are clearly independent accounts. The Gospel of Matthew doesn't have much to do with Paul's letter to the Corinthians. And really the independence of the accounts is emphasized by the fact that they're not even using the same name for Peter. One of them says Peter, one of them says Cephas. And so we, the readers, gain some confidence in the accuracy of what's behind this. There really was someone called Peter, who really was married, who really did have a wife and a mother-in-law. And that's not just a made-up thing, but it corresponds to something that both Matthew and Paul really knew about. Okay, let's have a look at another example. This one's to do with the feeding of the 5,000. Now, there are only two miracles which are recorded in all four Gospels. There's Jesus' resurrection, and there's this feeding of the 5,000. And the reason we call it the feeding of the 5,000 is that the number 5,000 is mentioned in all four Gospels. So this miracle comes in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they all tell us that there were 5,000 there. Now, the fact that this miracle is in all four Gospels means that there are quite a lot of sort of coincidences when you compare the accounts. We're just going to look at one of those coincidences now. Let's look first of all at Matthew's account. So Matthew says, when he's mentioning the 5,000, that those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So Matthew has that extra phrase, besides women and children, and the other accounts don't say that. And so it makes us wonder straight away, well, why can Matthew be sure that there are 5,000 men, and why isn't he telling us about how many women and children there are? And why is it that the one group is being counted and the other group hasn't been counted? Well, we need to look at the other accounts of this miracle to fill out the picture. So let's have a look at what Mark and Luke say. So Mark says that they had to sit down in groups, and they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And Luke, it's different wording, but he says something similar. Jesus said to his disciples, make them sit down in groups of about 50 each. And they did so, make them all sit down. So Mark and Luke explain that the people had to sit in groups of particular sizes, hundreds and 50s. And so you can see that that's going to make it easier to count the total number, isn't it? You can sort of see the groups there, and you can count, well, there's 50, 100, 150, 200, 250, and so on. And you can look at the whole of this vast crowd in front of you, and rather than seeing them all milling around and you're not really sure what the total is, you can get to a total of 5,000 fairly easily once you've got them to sit down and stay still and sit in groups. But from what Mark and Luke tell us there, you'd get the impression really that everybody sat down in these groups. So why is it that Matthew has a total for the men but not for the women and children? So now we need to look at what John says in his account. John doesn't mention the groups at all, but he does talk about this sitting down. Jesus said, make the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. So John is being careful with the words he uses here. And first of all, he says the idea was for the people to sit down, and the word that he uses there means people, human beings in general, anthropoi. But then he uses a different word for men in particular, excluding women and children, men, andres in Greek. And so it turns out that the women and children don't seem to have sat down in these specifically sized groups. And so that's why the men were easy to count. They were in groups of 50 and 100, but the women and children weren't easy to count. They weren't sitting in these groups. And so that's why Matthew is able to give a good figure for how many men there were, but really the number of women and children is unknown. They are extras. They weren't in groups that were easy to count. So this is an example of the four accounts kind of giving the ring of truth of that this really was an actual event. It's hard to imagine that the four writers sort of collaborated to drop these details in if they're writing about an event that didn't really happen. Much more straightforward explanation is that it really did happen, and they're just sort of giving different accounts of the same real thing. And it does have the ring of truth, doesn't it? I mean, I can imagine why the women and children wouldn't sit down as well. And getting all the children to sit down and stay still and wait while this big distribution of the food is going on would be tricky. But if all the dads sat down waiting for an allocation of food while the children are sort of playing elsewhere and they're being looked after by their mums, then that seems like a more kind of efficient and satisfactory way of organizing it. And so, it sounds like a real event, and the organization is kind of, you can infer it by putting all the four gospels together, but it's not making a big thing of the fact that this is why they were easy to count or anything like that. Okay. Let's have a look at another one. This coincidence now is to do with Joseph. So the Joseph that I'm talking about is the Joseph that was married to Mary, the mother of Jesus. It's interesting to look at where Joseph is mentioned in the Gospels, what's said about him and what's not said about him. Now, you may know that only Matthew and Luke's Gospels go back to Jesus' childhood, and the other two, Mark and John, start with Jesus as a grown man, about the age of 30. So what do we find in Matthew? Well, Matthew's Gospel starts with a genealogy. So it sort of starts with Abraham and Isaac, Jacob, and it goes down to King David, and it goes on through the Old Testament history and beyond, right up to, at the end of the genealogy, Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So Joseph kind of features straight away in this genealogy at the start of Matthew, and then a couple of verses later, he's right there, kind of central to the story. Now, the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way, when his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph. Before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And it goes into the Christmas story, the nativity story that is pretty familiar. And Joseph actually is quite prominent in that story. I think his name appears another 5 times in Matthew chapters 1 and 2. He's there in Bethlehem when the wise men come, and he's warned that Herod is going to come and try and kill Jesus in Bethlehem. And so Joseph has to flee to Egypt and take Jesus and Mary with him to keep them safe. And in fact, God keeps communicating with Joseph in these first 2 chapters over and over again in dreams. So Joseph is a big character, really part of the story and the action in Matthew in the early couple of chapters. So what about in Luke, which is the other gospel that records Jesus' early life? What do we find there? So in Luke it says that in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God to Galilee, a city of Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin betrothed to a man whose name was Joseph. So again, Joseph's right there at the centre of the story. But Matthew and Luke, they don't tell you about the same things, actually. It's in Matthew, it tells you all about the wise men coming. In Luke, it tells you about the shepherds and the angel Gabriel. But in both cases, Joseph is definitely part of the story. And in Luke here, Joseph takes Mary to Bethlehem for the census, and then he's there at the birth and the shepherd's visit. And there's also a genealogy in Luke in chapter 3, giving information about Joseph's lineage. And then in Luke, you do actually get a story which you don't get anywhere else in the Gospels, about what happened when Jesus was 12 years old. It explains that when he was 12, Joseph and Mary, Joseph's name isn't actually used here, but it talks about his parents, and it's evidently talking about Joseph and Mary. They go up to Jerusalem with Jesus, and Jesus goes to the temple and talks to the Jewish leaders there and amazes them with his knowledge, and then he stays behind, Jesus does, and his parents don't know about it. So Joseph is definitely there in the stories when Jesus is a baby, when he's 12. Joseph and Mary are together as the parents of Jesus, parents in inverted commas of Jesus, because Jesus, of course, really was the Son of God, not the son of Joseph. But the strange thing is that there is then only one more mention of Joseph in the Gospels, and we ought to just have a look at that. So it's here in John chapter 6. Now, in this chapter, what's happening is that Jesus is making big claims about himself that the Jews don't like, all about who Jesus is. So Jesus compares himself with the manna, which was the food that God provided for the Israelites in the wilderness, way back in the book of Exodus in the Old Testament. When Jesus says that he's like that manna, he says, "For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives to the world. I am the bread of life," says Jesus. "Whoever comes to me shall not ever thirst." He's making big claims for himself. He says, in fact, that God is Father. Now, the Jews who are listening to this don't like what's said and sort of say, well, these claims are ridiculous. We don't believe anything. Not the Joseph, whose father and that we know. So they're just saying, look, we know who Jesus is, we know who his father is, it's Joseph. Joseph isn't here in the story, he's not around in the story, but that's why he's mentioned. Apart from this reference to Joseph, there aren't any more in the Gospels at all after Jesus was 12 years old. Joseph isn't in any of the stories. He's not there on family occasions like a wedding feast that they go to in Cana. He's not there at the foot of the cross when Jesus dies. And in fact, there are places where other members of the family are mentioned and Joseph isn't. So let's just look at them. Matthew, where his mother and brother standing outside asking to his mother and his brother to him, with his mother and his brothers and his disciples. They stay there for a few days. And one in Mark is particularly interesting. It seems to be listing out the whole of Jesus' family. He's not this carpenter. They call him Jesus a carpenter, and they say about his family, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon. So he's got a mother, he's got these 4 brothers, his sisters are as well with us, but no mention of Joseph. If you were going to list out the family of Jesus and Joseph were around, you'd put him at the front of the list. Joseph and Mary would be at the start. So the impression that you get from all of this is that Joseph isn't mentioned because he's not around. Presumably he has died since Jesus was 12, sometime in between that time and when Jesus is 30 plus and is a grown man. None of the Gospels mention the fact that Joseph have died. They just describe all these events where Joseph isn't present and where he would have been mentioned had he been alive. There are another couple of passages that indicate the same idea. We've got this one in John chapter 19. So here Jesus is dying on the cross, and he puts his mother, Mary, into the care of John, the disciple. So when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." Now, this would make sense if Joseph was dead, but if Joseph had been alive, then either he could have looked after Mary himself, or he would be in need of care, and Jesus would be saying, "Well, look after my mother and my father. They both need to be looked after." It seems clear that Joseph isn't mentioned because he's not available to look after Mary. And the other passage which is worth mentioning is this one in Acts. So this is after Jesus has gone to heaven and the believers are gathering together in another room. That's listing out who was there. It says they were all with one accord devoting themselves to prayer, together with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. And so you get the impression from this that Mary and his brothers are staying in Jerusalem, even though Jesus has left, and they're sort of becoming part of the congregation in Jerusalem. They're staying there. In fact, one of Jesus' brothers, half-brothers, is still there more than 30 years later in the church in Jerusalem. So if Joseph had still been around, presumably Mary would have continued her family life with Joseph. She would have either kind of left to be where Joseph was, or Joseph would be here in this group in Jerusalem, living with Mary and Jesus' brothers here. And the obvious conclusion that we make is that Joseph, who had been alive when Jesus was 12 years old, had died before the start of Jesus' ministry. So there's no explicit statement of that, but it's just a constant feature of all the narratives across the Gospels and in Acts as well. It's not that the 4 Gospels and the book of Acts have some other sort of story or document that says outright, Joseph died before Jesus grew up, and then they all write their own fictional accounts of things that Jesus did based on that fact. Really, the more straightforward explanation of the consistency that we're seeing here is that they're all describing real events. Jesus really did do all of these things, and his family really didn't have a father figure, and that's why he's not in the stories. So this is good evidence that the records are recording things that actually took place. Okay, let's have a look at another one. This coincidence this time is to do with the last week before Jesus was crucified. So Jesus was put to death at the time of the Jewish festival of the Passover. What we'll do now is we'll compare what John's Gospel says about the timing of what Jesus did, and we'll compare that with what Mark's Gospel says. And the records in John and Mark are very different from each other. They record completely different events. But what we're going to do is just concentrate on the references to time that are scattered across those two Gospels. So first of all, what does John's Gospel say? It says 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, and they gave a dinner for him there. So Jesus is arriving at Bethany at the start of this last week before the crucifixion, and it says it's 6 days before the Passover, and this dinner, the word that's used there, means a kind of a supper, an evening meal. So this is at the end of this day, which was 6 days before the Passover, and it's happening in Bethany. It says, probably just worth us remembering where Bethany was. So here's Jerusalem. Bethany is about 3 kilometers, 2 miles to the east of Jerusalem. And it seems to be during this week that Jesus is staying there overnight. So what we read is he keeps sort of going into Jerusalem during the day, and then he goes out to Bethany and spends the night there. And he's going to and fro via the Mount of Olives, which is on the route between Bethany and Jerusalem. Okay, so let's have a look at what it says next. It says that 6 days before the Passover, in the evening, he had this supper. And then it says, in the same chapter, the next day, something happened. It's when Jesus goes into Jerusalem, and there's a big crowd there. They're waving the palm branches and they're shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's on the next day. So if the evening meal was 6 days before the Passover, that means that this then, when Jesus enters Jerusalem, the triumphal entry, that's 5 days before the Passover, because it's on the next day, it says. Now, in John's Gospel after this, after chapter 12, it doesn't really give you any more clues as to the timing of what's going on. What you get is that in chapters 13 right through to 17, there's a great long discourse where Jesus washes his disciples' feet, and he talks about being the true vine, and he prays for his disciples and so on. A big block of chapters. And then in chapter 18, immediately afterwards, he goes out to the Garden of Gethsemane and he's arrested. So John hasn't got a whole series of events between this 6 days before the Passover, or 5 days before the Passover, and the end of the week where Jesus is arrested and crucified. He skips straight from 5 days before the Passover right to Passover itself. So let's compare that with what we find in Mark. So Mark also talks about the triumphal entry of Jesus in Jerusalem, with the crowd waving the palm branches and singing, Hosanna, shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And it says, Jesus entered Jerusalem, and then he's in Jerusalem, and then afterwards, so he goes back to the night. Then so we know from John's Gospel that this happened 5 days before the Passover. Mark doesn't say that, but at least this one event of Jesus going into Jerusalem, which is in both Gospels. So it must be the same event on the same day, 5 days before the Passover. So what does Mark have after that? So Mark then says on the following day what happened. And in fact, what is Jesus comes from Bethany, where he's been staying overnight. He sees a tree, nothing on the fig tree, so he cursed the fig tree when the disciples did it. And then they go to Jerusalem, and it tells you what he did in Jerusalem. He goes into the temple and he drives out those who are selling in the temple, and he's angry with them. And then it finishes after that by saying when evening came, they went out of the city, so presumably out of the city and back to Bethany, where they're staying overnight. So it said that this was on the following day, so we can sort of keep track of which day we are on. This ought to be 4 days before the Passover now. Okay, and then we can carry on in Mark. Now, if you want to look at this yourself in your Bible, you have to sort of skip over everything that's happening and just look for these little time references to, going out to Bethany, or it's the next day or whatever. You have to work quite hard to work out which day you're on, but we do find that the next thing that happens, it says as they passed by in the morning, so we must be on the next day now, and it says they went past the fig tree again. And it's this fig tree that Jesus has cursed, and now it's withered, and Peter sort of remembers what has happened on the previous day, and it goes on to say that they came again into Jerusalem, and then there is a lengthy discussion in the temple in Jerusalem, which ends with chapter 13 verse 1, him coming out of the temple, and then they go to the Mount of Olives. So this is them on their way home again. They're coming out of Jerusalem, they go to the Mount of Olives, which is on the way back to Bethany, and we have a whole chapter 13 of Mark, called the Olivet Prophecy, where Jesus is on the Mount of Olives and he's telling his disciples about future events. It's a prophecy. Mark's been telling us what's been happening each day from the day that Jesus went into Jerusalem and the crowd waved the palm branches 5 days before the Passover. And by counting the evenings and the mornings and the journeys from Bethany to Jerusalem and back, we know that we're now up to 3 days before the Passover. And so then we want to know, well, what does Mark say happened next after Mark chapter 13 into Mark chapter 14? And the next day is described in Mark 14 verse 1 as being 2 days before the Passover. And it's back in Bethany now. While he was in Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard. So that's 2 days before the Passover. And you see the point, that the point is that the two chronologies completely match. The chronology that we worked out from starting with John's starting day, and then just weaving in these little details of the next day and the morning and the evening and so on in Mark, we find that we are indeed 2 days before the Passover, exactly when we were expecting to be. Now, these two accounts are clearly independent of each other. They don't have much in common at all, apart from the fact that they're to do with the Passover and they're before Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. You've got to do a real amount of digging in Mark's gospel to work out the timings of everything. But what you find is they match exactly. And so once again, Mark and John seem to be describing real events happening on real days of the week. And the fact that the mentions of time aren't the main point of either narrative imply that this coincidence really is an undesigned coincidence. Mark and John haven't got together and agreed to slip in some time references to make their accounts look more accurate. The straightforward explanation is that they're just describing real historic events. Okay, we've got one last coincidence to look at, which is to do with Simon of Cyrene. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke mention this character. He seems to be someone who was just grabbed at random and forced to carry Jesus' cross. But Mark has this unique little extra phrase. He says, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, and he's compelled to carry Jesus' cross. And so the question that you immediately ask yourself is, well, who are Alexander and Rufus, and why are they being mentioned here? Now, Simon isn't a main character. He doesn't play any other role in the gospel narrative. So why do we need to know who his sons are? We already know which Simon it is. It's Simon of Cyrene. So it's not Simon Peter. It's not Simon the Pharisee. It's not Simon the leper. We know it's Simon of Cyrene. We don't need the extra information to know which Simon it is, that it's also the father of Alexander and Rufus. So that seems to be redundant information. Now, an obvious reason for Mark to tell us who Simon was in terms of his children, Alexander and Rufus, is that Mark thinks that his readers and his audience would know about Alexander and Rufus, and so he's making a reference to somebody that they know about. Well, we can find that there is another mention of a Rufus in a completely different part of the New Testament, in a letter that Paul wrote to the believers in Rome. At the end of that letter, he says, "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, also his mother, who has been a mother to me as well." So there's somebody called Rufus in Rome. Well, perhaps that's a completely different Rufus from the one that's mentioned here, the son of Simon, who's evidently in Jerusalem. This Rufus in Rome. Rufus is quite a common name, and so these could be two completely different men. It's worth noting that at the time that Paul wrote his letter to the Romans, he'd never actually been to Rome. He says so at the start of the letter to the Romans. He says he wants to visit them sometime. He hasn't got round to it yet. And yet he knows Rufus, who is in Rome, and he knows his mother, and he seems to know them pretty well. He talks very warmly about Rufus's mother. She has been a mother to me as well. So the implication of that is that Rufus and his mother must have moved to Rome, having previously been somewhere that Paul has been to, somewhere at the east end of the Mediterranean, where Paul has visited. There's not a ridiculous assumption to say that they've moved to Rome from Jerusalem or nearby, and that's how Paul knows them and wants to greet them, and that this is indeed the same Rufus that we've read about in Mark chapter 15. And just to add to that, we could note that there's very early tradition based on some writings in the 2nd century AD that Mark's gospel was actually written by Mark in Rome, using information supplied to him by Peter, who was with him in Rome. Now, that may or may not be true. We don't know for certain. But if Mark's gospel was indeed written in Rome, and Mark's writing in Rome, then making mention of Rufus makes perfect sense, because Rufus would be known to the people in Rome where Mark was, because Rufus and his mother were there in Rome. And so it would make sense for Mark, when he's writing his gospel and he comes to Simon of Cyrene, to slip in the fact, well, Simon is the father of Alexander and Rufus, and that that would make sense for a reason why Mark puts in this otherwise completely irrelevant, strange comment. But when we put it alongside this other reference to Rufus, it allows us to surmise that it's quite likely that there really was a person called Rufus, and he was known to Mark's audience, and he migrated to Rome in the years after the crucifixion. Okay, so we've looked at 5 undesigned coincidences there. There are lots more to discover, and in fact there's already a video in this channel which has looked at a few of them, has a completely different set of coincidences from the ones that I've shown you just now, so you could try and find that and watch it if you're interested. So I find these coincidences compelling, convincing. I think perhaps if there were only 1 or 2 of them, then the argument that the Gospels are proved to be accurate by them wouldn't be particularly strong, but it's a sort of cumulative effect. Each time you find another of these undesigned coincidences, it adds to the sense that you've got stories here about Jesus in the Gospels that are history rather than fiction. So I hope you've enjoyed that presentation. Thank you for watching.